Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today in this video we are going to learn about how to connect multiple database in a Spring Boot application. So let me tell you what we are going to discuss. Okay, so let's suppose we have one application here. This is the application which we are going to write in Spring Boot framework, and this application is going to use two database. Let me draw here the database. Okay, so one database is going to store the actual data and the another database is going to store logging details. Logging details, I mean to say, it's not login details, it's about the logging of the applications. So all logs generated in this application will be stored in this DB. So let we call it as a DB2 and this as DB1. It happens most of the time in an application we need to have to connect multiple databases. So I mean, this is the scenario that what we are going to discuss now. So let's see what are the steps we need to follow in order to configure this configuration. So how to do this? So the first step would be you define the properties related to database in application.properties file. So what we do, we define, for example, I'm going to use db1, so I can define like this: my db dot db1 dot user. Similarly, you need to provide the password and all the other related properties that need to be mentioned here for a database. Similarly, you need to go ahead and create another properties like this: my db dot db2 dot user. So you are going to have two sets of properties, one for db1, another for db2. So this is the first step to define properties in application.properties file. What next? So next step would be configure data source. So we need to configure data source so that Spring comes to know which DB need to be connected while saving the objects. So in that case, there will be we need to go with configuration. So for example, we have a db1, so we can say like db1 data source configuration, data source config. Similarly, you will have db2 data source config. We'll see like what are the things that we need to take care inside this configuration files, but we need to have two database config data source configuration files. Okay, then the third one is we will have the entity, so that will be independent of this database, right? So I mean, if you are creating an entity like user, so you need to follow the same steps that you are following in case of having one database. So here there is no change. So entity, while creating entities, there is no difference. So basically these two steps are most important. So define different sets of properties and then configure them in the data source configuration file. So let's see what are the things we need to do inside this data source configuration file. So I'm going to discuss about data source configuration file, configuration, right? So in this one, first of all, we need to map the defined properties in the specific configuration file. So this db1, let's say I'm going to configure this data source configuration file for db1. So I need to configure the properties which are defined for db1. So the first step would be, we have to talk about one of the properties is @configuration properties. So we will see that. So the first step would be to use @configuration properties. Those who are not aware about these annotations, they can check my check my playlist for a video where I have discussed about configuration properties. So I have created a playlist called Spring Annotations. Inside that you will get this video. I'll share that link as well in the description below. So now we have the configuration properties, and here we need to mention the prefix. In this prefix we need to specify, like, what are the property name? We need to specify mydb.db1. that's it. So whichever the property starts with mydb.db1, that will be the part of this data source configuration. Okay, and the second step would be, using these properties we will get the data source configuration class object, and using that object we will get the data source. Don't worry, I'll show the code. And then using this data source we need to create entity manager factory bin. Entity manager factory bin, and then using this entity manager factory bin we need to create an object of platform transaction manager. Okay, so in this configuration file we need to first of all define the prefix for the specific properties. Using that we can get the object of data source configuration. It will help us to get the data source object, and data source object will be used to create the entity manager factory bin, and using that we will create a platform transaction manager. So we must have to create these bins. Okay, then only we will be able to use the this data source. Now one more important thing we need to mention here is, we need to use annotation on the top of this configuration file, that is @enable JPA repository. And there what we need to do, we need to define the base package and the transaction manager, and means this one is the entity manager, right? Entity manager reference and the transaction manager reference we need to define there. Similarly, we need to create one more configuration file, but that for db2. We need to follow the same process. Okay, so one very important thing I want to mention here is, because you have defined two data source, db1 and db2, so whenever the Spring application starts, Spring will find two implementations for the data source. So we must have to define one of the configuration as primary, then only Spring will be able to start the configuration and it will provide the entity manager factory builder. I'll show you what's up why we need this. But one of the, if whenever you are going to create more than one database, then one of the database must be marked as primary. Okay, so we discussed a lot. Let's get into the code and see how it works. So as we discussed, first of all, we need to define two sets of data source properties. So you can see I have created two sets of database here, database properties, like one for payment module, another is for order module. Okay, so now what I'm going to do here, wait, yes, so now we'll discuss about the configuration file. So here I have considered two database, one is for order database, another is for payment. So one is order database, another is payment database. So let's see the order data source configuration. So as I discussed, right, first of all we need to define the configuration properties, which will be which will map the data from the first set of properties, like for the which is defined for order database. So you can see here I have mentioned like prefix order dot data source. So whichever the properties starts with order dot data source, that will be mapped with data source properties class. Okay, so we will have the one instance of data source properties. Using that instance, what we are going to create, we are going to create an instance of data source. It means we are going to define a bin of data source. So you can see that I am using get data source properties, where initialize data source builder type basic data source dot class dot build. So this one is going to provide me an instance of data source when the application starts. Fine. Now we need to define the entity manager factory. So I have given a name to this bin as an order entity manager factory. So this order entity manager factory needs data source. So that's why, yeah, so here we have entity manager factory builder as well. So this will be injected by Spring when we are going to start the application. Using that entity manager factory builder, it takes the data source and then it creates an entity manager factory bin using the entity manager factory builder. Once we have the local container entity manager factory bin here, this will be used to create a platform transaction manager. So you can see that here what I have done, we have used the local container entity manager factory bin, and that bin is utilized to create a platform transaction manager. Okay, so whatever we have defined bin here, that bin is going to be used to create a platform transaction manager. And the last step, we need to define enable JPA repositories, where I have to pass the base package. So let's discuss what is the base package. So this base package says this data source should be used for all the repositories which are defined under this package. So if I show you, I have created two repository packages. One is for order, another is for payment module. So here you can see that I have created an order package. Here we have a payment package. So whichever the repositories defined under this package will use order data source. Packages defined under payment package will use payment data source. So if I show you the payment data source configuration, it also looks like the same. So we need to define the same thing here. You can look at this, and then we need to have entity manager factory bin and transaction manager reference. So three things we need to define. So whatever the entity manager factory bin name you have given here, that you need to pass it to here. Okay, so we discussed about the application properties, we discussed about the data source configuration. Now the third thing is creating the entities. So as I said, right, there is nothing special while creating entities. So see, this is the this is the order entity, and let me show you. So inside this order entity I have not defined anything. Okay, this is a normal entity. Now if we see the order repository, in order repository also we have not defined anything related to data source. So this, I mean, and the runtime, on the runtime, Spring will be able to decide which database need to be picked up based on the data source configuration. The annotation we define at the rate enable JPA repository. Based on this annotation and the base package, Spring will be able to identify which database, which data source need to be used to persist the database, persist the data. Okay, so now fine. So we discussed everything about this. Now it's time to run the application and see how it works. So now we are ready to start this application and see how the data is going to be persisted in database. So I have started the application. Application is up now. Now let me show you the controllers. So I have created one app controller where is this endpoint is /multidb, and there is something called order and payment. So in the request object we are taking this order details DTO, where we are getting the quantity, and for payment details we are getting this minimum information. Okay, so let's go back to the controller, and if we see about the service layer, so what we are doing here, we are directly calling the repositories. So whatever we are getting, we are directly calling the repositories. So my intention here is to show you how we are able to save or persist data into two databases from one application. So I have not implemented here service layer. I mean the controller layer itself I'm going to save data into the database. So let's test this application. So we have /order/payment. Before executing this endpoints, see there is no schema created. Okay, so let's hit this. So endpoint is multiple db. So it's started here. So let me go and test multi-db/order. So what kind of object we need? We need two kind minimum details like quantity and price. So what we can do quickly, we can create the request object quantity, let's make it 10, and then here price, consider this as a, okay. So this is the dummy data. Let's click on hit send. So data is stored. Now we are getting the stored data from the database because we didn't define the ID number, but in return we are getting the ID. So let me show you the controller here. So in the controller you can see that whatever the data is persisted into the database, we are getting the same, we are returning the same entity to the client. So let me go to the MySQL workbench and refresh this. So you can see that first of all order is created. If you go into the tables, we have order details, and if we query this table, so we can see that there is one entry where the price is 1200 and quantity is 10. Now as of now in the payment, one sec, let me just, so as of now in the payment details table there is no data, so we are going to store data for payment details. So now here instead of order I can do payment. So what are the details I need to provide? Let me show you. So payment details need card number, card name, expiry and CVV. So we need to have card number, card name, I'll correct the values, and CVV, then expiry. Okay, some data we can mention, right? 29/03/2029. Okay, and the card name is Prabhakar, and the card number we can enter dummy card number. Okay, so now this is the request object for payment endpoint, right? So let's save this. So payment details saved successfully. So if it is saved successfully, it means that in the DB this information need to be stored in a different schema, not in the order schema. So here you can see. So let me refresh this. Now you can find the data in this payment details table. So now it's very clear, right? We use two database from one application and data is getting saved in two different database. So let me conclude this. We have an application. We have one application here that we discussed, like we have one application, and from one application we want to store data in two different databases. So that's why we need to create two different data source, entity manager, factory bin, platform transaction manager, and we need to configure them properly so that whenever we are trying to persist an entity from a respective repository, that should be persisted into a particular DB. So in our case we saw, right, this is considered as a order DB and this one considered as a payment DB. So based on the endpoint and based on the module, right, whatever the entity we created, and that entity is being used by repositories. So based on the repositories, it is decided whether it should go to order DB or it should go to payment DB. Because here if you see, that's what we have mentioned in the configuration in the order details data source or order data source configuration. We have mentioned here like base package. So we are saying that any repository created under this package should use this data source, and this data source is nothing. This data source is going to connect with the order DB. Similarly, in the case of payment DB, any repositories created under this payment package should be connected with the payment DB. So that's it. I mean, it's very straightforward. It's very simple project I have created. Don't worry about the code. It is available on the GitHub. I'll share the GitHub link in the description as well. So I mean, this is not, I don't want to show you very complex example here. It's very simple example, and then after you can utilize as you want. But I hope it's clear. Thank you so much for watching my video, and if you really like it, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe my channel. Thank you so much.